Good afternoon, church. This is Pastor Keven Newsome here, continuing the series on the generational influence on the church, past, present, and future with session 7. And today I'm going to be talking about the cycle of the church. So last session we talked about the historical cycles and how the generations worked with that and the cycles of the four generations. And here's the overview I had of that, where high periods are characterized by strong institutions, weak individualism, and a confident society. And you see the generations that are there with that. Awakening cycles are characterized by an attack on institutions and lack of individuality, and then there's unraveling, weak institutions, strong individualisms, and the crisis cycle, which is the result of the unraveling, where institutions are destroyed and rebuilt. We are currently on the back end of a crisis cycle, which means once all of this craziness that's going on in the world right now, this 2020 year begins to settle down and we can move forward. We're going to see, I should say, if these cycles continue the way that they've been observed in the past, we should see society move into a high cycle where we have strong institutions, weak individualism, confident society, and such. So I want to take what we talked about in the last session and add the church to it. I talked about the book, the fourth turning by Strauss and Howe, and how they're the ones that really pioneered and recorded and did all the research on these cycles with generations and history. How the churches fit into that is my own research. You're not going to find it in their book, but you will find most of this in my book. I've added some to it for the sake of this video, these sessions here for you. Some new information that needs to be updated in my book. So when we look at the church in regards to the cycles, we see these basic trends. And I'm going to really show you these things at work in some charts here. So during a high cycle, we generally see church growth and stability, and I needed to have added mission movements to that as well. During an awakening cycle, we tend to see revival movements, major revival movements. I'm not talking about small or localized revival movements. I'm talking about something that's major. All of our major revival movements that are recorded in history happened during an awakening cycle, all the way back to the Protestant Reformation. So the Protestant Reformation, all three Great Awakens, the first, second, third Great Awakenings, the Jesus movement, all were part of these awakening cycles. So these major revival movements happened during those times. The unraveling cycles, we tend to see a trend towards fundamentalism. Now, when I say fundamentalism, I'm not necessarily saying the fundamentalists are the ones on the right side. The fundamentalists are on the side of the way it's always been. So we can see things that are very negative. So in the case of the Protestant Reformation, we'll see that there was a counter-Reformation that included some really violent times in the period of the Reformers. So that's that return to fundamentalism that was attempted by the Catholic Church during that time. So we see those during unraveling cycles. During crisis cycles, we tend to see division, toleration, and creativity. So there's three ways of getting at this crisis time in the church. Either we see some marked division, so we see like lots of division along denominational lines and things such, things like that, methodologies and things like that. Toleration, we see some of these where these divisions have happened. We begin to see some toleration where they're tolerating each other to an extent. And creativity is really a big hallmark of the church in the crisis period. We see some very creative approaches to how to do church, how to reach people, and creative approaches on how to survive as a church. during these crisis periods throughout history. So I've expanded the charts that I showed you last week with these cycles in order to really get you a better understanding of how the cycles are affecting church. I want you to see some more of these cycles in history. So I went all the way back to 1478 when we have a high cycle, and historically we had the Tudor Renaissance, and there's our church trend, growth, stability, and mission movements. So during this time we have a new status quo of success. I didn't mention that. I probably should have mentioned that here. During the high period, we tend to have a new status quo of success, as well as a church growth and stability. So that means that our definitions of what is successful have changed as a result of the crisis. So the church trend is growth and stability in mission movements, and the event means we have a new status quo of success. And missionally, during this high cycle, we see a lot of New World missions by the Franciscans, the Dominicans, and the Jesuits. A lot of people forget during this time where the discovery of the New World and Columbus and all the exploration of the New World, that the Catholic Church was growing at an enormous pace. These Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits were sending out missionaries into these new lands that had been discovered, and as a result, on the backside of this, we see some very heavily Catholic influence in some of our Latin American countries as a direct result of this mission work. So a lot of people forget about that. Next in the cycle is an awakening. We had the Protestant Reformation during this awakening, the trends for the revival, trends for the Church of Revival, and the church event is the Protestant Reformation. Some of these church trends, these revival trends, are so important historically that they are the historical event as well as the church event. Next we have an unraveling. During this time we saw a lot of intolerance and a lot of martyrdom on the part of the Catholic Church, trying to squash out a lot of these Protestant factions that are springing up all over Europe. The church trend is toward fundamentalism, and so of course we have the Counter-Reformation and the Council of Trent, which basically what began the official Counter-Reformation for the Catholic Church. And that brings us into the crisis cycle, which we have the Spanish-English conflict, the Spanish Armada and the English Armada, the conflict there between the colonization and the fighting of the ships. Church trend, division, toleration, and creativity. And so we see in the churches we have Protestant settlements happening, and a lot of religious flights. So they've had to get creative about how they're going to do things, and we see division in that we have some of them are trying to stay and fight the fight of Reformation in Europe, and some of them are just getting out and going to the New World. So we see some division and creativity going on there. In our next set of cycles, the next high, we have the English Renaissance, and in the church we have a new status quo of success. Things begin to stabilize for the church during this time. Then we have an awakening with the Puritan Revolution, which is a revival movement, and again the Puritan Revolution as a church event. Unraveling cycle, we have the colonial unrest in the Americas. We have a return to fundamentalism with the Clarendon Code, which just really pushed against some of this enlightenment that's going on in Europe. Then we have the crisis cycle, which we have the First Indian War and the English Revolution. In the church we see the Act of Toleration, and also the Salem witch trials happened during this crisis. The Salem witch trials only happened over about a year and a half, but I thought it very interesting that we find this act of panic in the colonies over witchcraft that happens during this crisis period. So we see that sort of that divisiveness going on in the church. Some of these things I'm not going to talk too much about, like the Clarendon Code, the Act of Toleration, Puritan Revolution. If you want to find out more information about these things, there's all kinds of information online about them. Just Google them, look them up, for yourself. Our next cycle brings us into the 18th century with the British superpower. Um, and when in the church, we have a new status quo of success based off of what we learned during the crisis and how we changed during the crisis. We come to an awakening, and here we see the First Great Awakening, both as a historical event and the church event. Then the unraveling, we have the French and Indian War, deism, empiricism, and over in the church, we have fundamentalism rising up through the rationalists and the pietist movements. The crisis cycle of this time is the American Revolution and all of the events surrounding that. In the church, we see religious freedom is really a rallying cry, but we also see things like the circuit riders and the Sunday school being formed. This is that creativity I was talking about, in that churches couldn't afford to have a pastor for themselves, so the pastors would ride a circuit in order to serve more churches. And then the Sunday school was founded, where we have education happening in the church. So this idea of creativity happening, we see it very clearly here during this crisis. The next cycle, next high, we have American independence and romanticism is coming about, and in the church, that new status quo as a result of the crisis. But here I've recorded some of the missionary movements during this time. We see the missionary work of William Carey. The London Mission Society was founded. Also the American Bible Society, which is the foundational society behind the Gideons, was also founded during this time. The next cycle is an awakening. We have another Great Awakening. We have the Second Great Awakening, both as a historical event and a church event. Then we come to an unraveling, the Mexican War, Dred Scott, the Underground Railroad. Things are unraveling quickly leading up to the Civil War. Over in the church, there's a return to fundamentalism with the Oxford movement. Then brings us to a crisis, which is the American Civil War. Over in the church, we see a lot of church racism propaganda. So this is division and toleration. And to an extent, churches were getting very creative about how they were presenting their message. So you had a lot of churches that were preaching toleration and this sort of desegregation idea within the church. But you also had a lot of traditional Southern churches that are preaching division, full division, and everything. So we see that in the church, division and toleration. Not so much creativity during this time. Also want to point out that Strauss and Howe in their book record this crisis period as a very short crisis period, only 5 years, and they also record that one of the generation archetypes is skipped because of the American Civil War. The American Civil War was such a tumultuous time. But for the entire world, a lot of people forget how much of the world got involved in what was happening here. That it was so traumatic that it sort of created this glitch in this pattern of cycles. So we still have the crisis; it's just truncated, and we have a sort of a skip in a generation archetype here. Next cycle, and you see here, this is where this is the chart that I showed you last session, except now I've added the churches to it, and so you see the generations listed as well, so you can follow those. And again, reminder is PNHA. Those stand for prophet, nomad, hero, and artist generation. Those are the 4 generation archetypes that you can watch, refresh your memory by watching last week's session on what those mean. I've got the name of the generation and then the age bracket that generation would be in during this time. Again, pay attention to the midlifers and the young adults. Those are the ones that are mostly in charge and running things or shaping things for the next cycle. So midlifers and young adults would be shaping society for the next cycle, where the children would come up and to be young adults. All right, so in this set of cycles, we have a high cycle. The historical event would be Reconstruction, the Gilded Age, Second Industrial Revolution, and over in the church, we see this new status quo of success. Again, on the backside of this crisis, we've redefined what it means to be successful as a church. The church sort of stabilizes on the backside of the Civil War. And we see just a significant event. The missionary work of Lottie Moon begins during this time. Of course, Lottie Moon spent her entire life in missions, but she began her mission and felt the call to mission work during this high cycle. The next cycle is an awakening cycle. We have the Third Great Awakening and the rise of labor unions, and of course the church event is the Third Great Awakening. The unraveling cycle is World War I, Prohibition, and over in fundamentalism we have American fundamentalism over in the church events. And so what that means, if you think about what's happening during World War I and Prohibition, there was this push towards this fundamental idea of returning to the church, and so the church is really a driving force behind Prohibition, and this sort of door knocking missionary work that's going on during this time. Next cycle is the crisis, Great Depression, World War II. And in the church we have some faith distinctions and radio broadcasts. So what that means is it's during this time that we really begin to see some separation in some of our American denominations, some of these Western denominations. We even though they had existed, these Protestant denominations really coexisted, but during this time we begin to see some real division, some real split, especially between with Pentecostalism, over the issue of Pentecostalism. So we see these denominations that are sort of trying to embrace. They're trying to answer the question of what to do with Pentecostalism. And some denominations actually split because of this, because you have some of them that are in favor of Pentecostalism, some of them that are not in favor of Pentecostalism. So we begin to see some real faith distinctions. On the creativity side, churches are beginning to embrace radio broadcasting and beginning to get sermon material out onto the radio for people to be able to listen to at home. Our next cycle gets us into some modern history that some of you watching this may remember. We have between the 40s, 50s, and early 60s, the American superpower, desegregation, our historical events. During that high period, that was our last high. And in the church, we have a new status status quo of success. The church really had some of their strongest time. We see WMU has its highest membership ever, and Campus Crusade for Christ was founded during this time, and so some really strong mission work going on during this high period for the church. Next cycle is an awakening. The consciousness revolution, Vietnam. Over in the church, we have the Jesus movement. So a big revival movement that went on during that time. Then the unraveling, national debt, culture wars. And over in the church, we have the conservative resurgence, which is a really big deal in Southern Baptist life. A lot of you remember that. So that was that return, that trend of fundamentalism showing up during the unraveling. And of course, our current crisis time, our crisis cycle, the 2008 recession, war on terror, COVID-19, these race riots that are going on. Just a lot of craziness going on right now. And we should be on the backside or near the end of this crisis. But during this time, we've seen a lot of creativity, some division, some toleration going on in the church. So we have the rise of progressive Christianity, the relational church movements, multi-site church movements, internet streaming, all of these creative ways to try to reach the church, and we see a lot of churches trying to embrace this idea of toleration of different lifestyles and things like that, and we see some division on whether or not a church should be a relational church of toleration, or whether or not a church should remain a little more fundamental. So we see a little bit of all three: division, toleration, and creativity. So if we were to move forward and try to use these cycles to see what the next 20 years are going to look like, so I showed you this last week, now I've added the church to it. We should have approximately 20 years from 2021 to about 2040 to be our next high cycle. This is going to be characterized by whatever comes after this coronavirus, COVID-19, whatever the aftermath is. Church trend should be growth, stability, and mission movement. We should see a new status quo of success in the church, and we should see some new mission organizations. So what does this mean for the church? There are some things to look forward to and things that the church should prepare for. A major revival movement is unlikely in the next 20 years. Now, a lot of people are calling for, we need a new worldwide revival. We need a new Great Awakening. Well, historically, according to these cycles, major revivals, mind you, major global revivals, significant enough that they define history, that they make the history books. That's the type of revival I'm talking about. Protestant Reformation, Great Awakenings, things like that. Historically, significant major revivals are typical of awakening cycles, not high cycles. So we're moving into a high cycle. So we should anticipate a major revival movement between 2040 and 2060 when we enter that next awakening cycle. However, the church should enjoy over the next 20 years a period of stability and growth such that we haven't seen in about 80 years. This stability and growth will come about as a result of a new status quo of success, meaning only churches who have adapted during the crisis period are going to experience this stability and growth. So this status quo of success, this new status quo, is a direct result of all of this experimentation that the church does during the crisis, this creativity, this division, these new ideas. We're trying to work things out. We're trying to sort out problems. We're trying to figure out what side of the fence we're on, and we're trying to figure out how to get the message out more effectively to people. All this division, creativity, toleration, all of these things that we've been doing during the crisis. If we've been working through that and wrestling with that, and we've come to a new status quo of what it means for us to be successful as a church, then that church should experience a period of stability and growth. On the back side of that, if a church has resisted change or adaptation, and they haven't participated in these discussions, they haven't wrestled with the issues, they've just maintained what they've always had from the last high. Now, interestingly enough, when people think about the glory days of the church, most people are going to point to that last high period that we experienced in the 40s and 60s, right here on your screen, during the American superpower. Those are the years that most people are going to say those were the glory years of the church. That's what I remember. I wish the church could be like that. But the problem is the church was only like that because of the lessons they learned during the previous crisis. And so they took those lessons, they adapted, they changed, and they were able to stabilize the church. So likewise, the lessons we are learning now If we successfully learn those lessons and we're able to adapt and we're able to reach a new status quo of success, then we should experience an unprecedented time of stability and growth. Churches that don't do that are likely to experience instability and decline. This stability is important because stability in the church and relative worldwide stability, remember that stability is not just about the church, it is a high time in the world. So there's relative worldwide stability. So this will or may give, should give the church unprecedented missional potential. Every time we've seen the cycle turn into a high, we see a spike in the missional response of the church to the world. So it's really something to look forward to. It may not be the great revival people are wanting or are hoping for, but it is the mission work of this period that will lead to the great revival during the next awakening cycle. So right now we're looking for that revival, and as a result we should take the stability that we have, this growth that we have, and we get a chance to push out into the world with unprecedented missional potential over the next 20 years. All right. So if you want to learn more about the cycles, this is the book that a lot of that research came from, about the cycles of history and the cycles of the generations. The church is not included in this book. This is not a religious book. This is a secular book. The research on the church is research that I did and included that research here in my book. It does need to be updated. I will gladly send you the PDF for free if you like. So that is it. Next week, I plan to will be our last session. Session number 8 is the last session, and we're going to talk about strategies to strengthen and grow the church based on what we've learned from these generations, based on what we've learned about the characteristics of the generations. Each generation, that's the living generation of the church, based on what we've learned from the characteristics of the generation archetypes, based on what we've learned on how these things are going to cycle over the next few years, based on what we learn on what to expect with the future of the church if it cycles according to the historical cycles. What can we do right now to strengthen the church, to reach the people of the church, and to reach the people around us, and to lay the foundation for the future of the church? So those are the things I'll be discussing next week in our final session, session number 8. Thank you for watching. God bless and have a good day.